to ending homelessness for more than 15 years, primarily serving in leadership positions in state and local government. She has held senior roles at the Massachusetts Interagency Council on Housing and Homelessness and the City of Boston's Mayor's Office of Housing, focusing on housing strategies to end homelessness across populations. Since August of 2023, she has been an independent consultant. Her current projects include serving as housing coach for a Medicaid and housing partnership accelerator, drafting an update for Massachusetts Olmstead plan, and serving as regional technical assistance point of contact to several CoCs in Region 9, which includes Oahu. So just please put your name and affiliation in the chat, and I will turn it over to Laila.
Okay, wait, I'm trying to show.
Thanks, Laura. So Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about slide 2 about the CoC and what you all are working on to strengthen the Housing First in the system?
Yeah, absolutely. So as most of you know, hopefully, we're working on a strategic plan. We've got 10 priorities. And so this type of a training, focusing on housing first and helping to keep people stay housed, is an important part of that strategic plan. Many of you guys are involved in creating the new assessment tool. Currently, we use the VI SPDAT, but we are working with all of our providers to see what other type of tool would work best for our community and address some of the concerns that the VI SPDAT had, which included racial equity. We're also working on the written standards for our CoC and making sure that we have policies and procedures in place that support the model of housing first. We're, as anybody who has a CoC grant, we've been going around and monitoring and evaluating all of the programs that are CoC funded. We will be following that up also with any entity that has ESG funding. So housing first and how you're incorporating it into your program is a very important part of the monitoring and evaluation. We're also working with Medicaid and making sure that the CIS programs are the best and easiest for providers to participate in. And we're also working with them on the development of their new housing program that will be coming up sometime in the future, and that will provide rental and utility assistance to folks who are on Medicaid. And then gathering feedback from all of you providers and offering support. That's what Partners in Care is here for, to support all of the providers so that you can do the best work out in the field. Okay.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, everyone who's here. I'm very happy to be here virtually with all of you today. And I've been working closely with the Partners in Care team over the last several weeks to design this training. I want to acknowledge that in the survey that went out with the registration link, we learned that there's a handful of you, or 12% of you, are experts in Housing First already. 61% of you are familiar with Housing First, and 27 of you have no familiarity with Housing First. So we have a diverse range of experience with Housing First here as part of the training. So I'm going to tell you, what you can expect. This is an overview training about the Housing First approach and what it looks like in practice. It's introductory. This is at the 101 level. So for many of you, especially the experts, this is not going to be new information, more of a refresh, but it is an opportunity for your teams and your community to hear the same message together, and for you all to think about your part in strengthening Housing First as a community. So this training is not going to be a training about the resources or referral network in your area. I don't know that, so that this training won't help you advance that piece. But as you heard from Laura, this is just one piece in a larger collective exploration of supporting Housing First and related practices in your community. And as part of that, it's working on how to figure out together to overcome the challenges of Housing First. So one outcome of this training may be to surface where practitioners in your community need more support, albeit more resources in your system, or a policy or practice change, or more trainings, etc. So Housing First as a concept is really pretty simple, but as a practice, it's not easy to do, and there are bumps all along the way. It's difficult, and everyone, I think we can all agree, everyone deserves to be housed. No one wants to live outside, and no one should have to. And the opposite of homelessness is housing. So housing everyone is what you need to do to reduce encampments. Housing everyone is what communities need to do to equitably end homelessness for everyone, including the most vulnerable. And Housing First is the approach that results in housing everyone. So a few things about the training. Unlike children who learn things right away, adult learners, on average, maybe not you, but on average, need to hear things 5 to 7 times before it sticks with us. For me, it's probably more than that. So there is some repetition in the hour we're going to have together in the material, and that's intentional. And then we also ask that you put questions and comments in the chat as we go along, and we will try to get to answer questions, at least some of them, at the end. But either way, everything will be captured if it's in the chat, and there'll be opportunity for follow-up. So before we start, I want to offer a story about a woman I met many years ago, and I will call her Anna. By the time I met her, she had been homeless for many years, and her son was in and out of her care. She was a very loving mother and had unacknowledged mental illness, including paranoia, and didn't want to engage in anything clinical. No clinical services, no conversations about mental health. That's where she was at. So when I met her, she had been recently housed by a Housing First permanent supportive housing program, and she was receiving food stamps and cash assistance, but her income was very, very low. And I was her Housing First stabilization worker while I was an intern for my social work training, and I spent a year visiting her in her apartment. And it seemed like mostly all we did was chat and drink soda together for a year. That's pretty much what we did. One time I helped her move boxes. Occasionally I would go with her to the public assistance office when there were issues with her benefits to help her get them resolved, but mostly we drank soda together. I wasn't able, in the time that I had with her, to get her to apply for the Social Security Administration benefits we thought she was entitled to due to her serious and persistent mental illness. And that was what my supervisor had hoped. And she didn't want to do it because it involved a psychological evaluation. She didn't agree to doing that. But right after I left, she was sanctioned by the public assistance office and her cash assistance was cut. And so she had no income. And I learned later that at that point, she got scared about losing her housing and becoming homeless again with her son, and it became an opening for her. So she allowed my supervisor to support her through the Social Security Administration application process, and she eventually got approved. That income kept her and her son stable in their apartment. So many of you have hundreds of stories like this, probably more complicated stories than this, but the point of the story is that people make their own decisions and on their own time frame, and that housing and stability and providing stability for loved ones is a major motivator, and that our job when we're in a Housing First supportive service role is to be present, to build trust, and to partner with people in their journey to stability. So this slide, what is Housing First? Housing First is an approach to quickly and successfully connect individuals and families experiencing homelessness to permanent housing without preconditions or barriers to entry, such as sobriety, treatment, or service participation requirements. So the approach is guided by the belief that people need basic necessities like food and a place to live before they can attend to anything less critical, like getting a job or budgeting properly or addressing substance use issues. The supportive services are more effective once the daily stress of experiencing homelessness is taken out of the equation. So Housing First can be implemented in different types of permanent supportive housing settings. So this could be in scattered site models, in the private market apartments like Anna lived in, where there's rental assistance provided and tenants have access to mobile and site-based supportive services. This could be Housing First is sometimes provided in single site models in which permanent supportive housing buildings are newly constructed or rehabilitated, and tenants have access to voluntary on-site services. Or some cases, this is kind of a hybrid. It's in set-aside units where supportive services are offered to participants in designated units within larger affordable housing or housing developments. Next slide, please. Oh, we're still on agenda. That was this slide. So we're done with this slide. This is what is Housing First. And now we're on to principles of Housing First. Thank you for that thumbs up. So these are some of the principles that Housing First is based on. So there's constant work to lower the barrier admission policies for housing. So permanent supportive housing's admissions policies are designed to screen in the most vulnerable rather than to screen out applicants with the greatest barriers to housing, such as having no income or very low income, poor rental history, and past evictions or criminal histories. So there's no subjective evaluation of who will succeed in housing or who won't. That's unknowable, and in large part is about how people are supported once they're housed. So one example I know of from another community around lowering barriers is they had one permanent supportive housing program, and they found a way. It was for people with serious and persistent mental illness. They found a way for people who were unwilling to sign paperwork to waive the requirement that someone actually sign their lease. But it was housing, it was permanent housing, and it was a tenancy. So another kind of principle of Housing First is around equity. So barriers created by systemic racism and other oppressions, and barriers created by related systems like the carceral system must be accounted for and addressed. So the homeless response system is responsible to remove these barriers in order to actually end homelessness for everyone. If we don't do that, vulnerable people will remain homeless and our homeless response will be inequitable. So the practice of Housing First accounts for inequities, utilizes cultural humility, and utilizes trauma-informed care. And then the last principle on this slide, Housing First uses individualized and evidence-based approaches. So supportive services are tailored to what each individual needs and what they want to engage in, but always focused on housing stability and well-being. Services might include connecting people to formal supports like a doctor, a therapist, or a social worker, or it might involve connecting people to informal supports like connecting with family, friends, or faith groups. In any case, Housing First is not prescribed. The services are not prescribed. So people have agency to select the services they need and want, and the supports are tailored to their own unique situation. Some people may come in knowing what they need to be stable. They may say, I need a job, I need a pet, I need childcare, I need home health aid. Others may not, and it will take time to develop a trusting relationship to listen and observe and work with someone to figure out what they need. Sometimes people will need support with tenancy skills and life skills, but rarely would someone say that outright. Sometimes services that someone needs can be provided by case managers, and in other times the case managers act as a hub and refer people to other services in the community, making sure that that connection is made. So I see the poll is up. This is about, from your perspective, which of these principles does your agency practice? So we've had 27 responses. I'll give it another few seconds for anyone else who wants to respond. Okay, and it looks like it's kind of a mix and certainly not all of them, but so we think half of you are saying all of these principles are part of your agency's philosophy. That's wonderful. And then some of you answered one or two of the principles are incorporated. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Housing First is not a program. Some programs might be called Housing First, but Housing First is not a program. It's a whole system orientation and response. So this slide shows the components of building or strengthening a Housing First system. So the first one in box one is about detangling service engagement from tenancy or lease compliance. So in Housing First, services are voluntary for the client. There's no requirement that they must see a case manager. That said, the services are not voluntary for the provider. Providers must be continuously and proactively offering services. But ultimately, the requirement of Housing First programs is that tenants abide by the terms of their lease, which is about being a tenant and nothing more. So second, creating a housing first system is about examining the rules. And this is really an invitation for everyone to start questioning rules or processes that are getting in your way. So really quite often rules are put in place and no one knows, or people have forgotten if it's regulatory from HUD or if there's another reason for it. So what I urge you all to do is, if there's a rule or a process that's making things harder to get people housed and keep them housed, start asking the question, why is this the rule? Where does this come from? And can we change it? Some rules may not be changeable when you dig in, but you may find that some rules or practices are changeable. So raise it to your supervisor, your agency leadership, or CoC working groups, or to pick and dig in and see where improvements can be made. Many of the written rules that the CoC is either revising or already has are intended to support Housing First. These are the CoC written standards that are being updated, contracts, applications, monitoring questions. They're all supposed to align, but everything is open for questioning and revision if it's hindering Housing First practices. That's what a strong CoC is there to do. Third, alcohol or drug use is not a basis for eviction. The lease is the document that determines if someone is breaking the terms of the contract, and people should be supported even if they do break some terms of the lease, to rectify the issue when possible. So sometimes a lease violation is exactly when someone starts engaging in supportive services, because once housing is at stake, they may be motivated to seek support in order not to lose it, just like Anna was when she lost her income. The fourth component is about providing system-wide support for lowering barriers to all program entry. So in a Housing First system, housing programs and coordinated entry have tenant selection and prioritization policies that prioritize people who have been homeless the longest and have the highest service needs, as evidenced by chronic homeless status or vulnerability assessments or high utilization of crisis services. So the purpose of the coordinated entry policies and procedures, the working groups, and case conferencing is to work together to support lower barriers and help vulnerable people navigate through to housing. PIC is open to feedback about how to offer more support in this realm, so continue to provide feedback. Number 5 is ensuring leadership, managers, and staff have tools to implement Housing First. You are all at this training. 12% of you are already experts. That's more than 12 of you in Housing First, and can support others in the community in this practice. Having the tools to implement Housing First is another story, and every community struggles with this. Housing First is not a model that is easily funded and as robust as it should be really anywhere. So if there are gaps that need to be filled to support your practice, keep lifting those up and advocating for the system to have the resources you need to do this. And then number 6, program and system-wide monitoring and performance improvement. This relates to the current in-depth monitoring of CoC providers, and it's also an opportunity to have this dialogue about where providers need more support to do Housing First. Okay, so I think we have a poll up. Okay, just went up, so check, let's see, the prompt is, do any of these stand out to you as areas to improve in your programs or where you would like support? So these are the 6 boxes that we just talked about. I'll be quiet for a minute. Okay, it's interesting. It seems like there are votes in every category, but there are a lot of votes coming in for number 5, ensuring leadership, managers, and staff understand and have the tools to implement Housing First. That's not surprising that that is a need. Oh, and we're also seeing, yep, I think that's the one that has the most. Okay, next slide, please. So Housing First does not mandate participation in services either before obtaining housing or in order to retain housing. So preconditions or prerequisites to housing might be something like requiring demonstration of or commitment to sobriety. It might be completion of behavioral health treatment or budgeting classes, or even just agreeing to comply with a treatment plan or a service plan upon entry into the program, or a requirement that people first go through transitional housing or shelter before entering permanent housing. Those are all preconditions and they are not part of Housing First. Sobriety and compliance in behavioral health treatment are not necessary to succeed in housing. So instead, the Housing First approach views housing as the foundation for stability and enables access to permanent housing without conditions beyond those of a typical renter. The lease, the tenancy is the agreement. Supportive services are offered to support people with housing stability and individual well-being, but participation is not required because services have been found to be more effective when a person chooses to engage. So many people do experience improvements in quality of life, and many of you have witnessed that in your work in the areas of health, mental health, substance use, employment, as a result of achieving housing. And housing is a platform of stability from which people can set their goals and make progress towards them. It's an approach for everyone, including extremely vulnerable people with complex challenges. So in other approaches, like substance use treatment programs, there are requirements in order for a person to stay in a program. But Housing First is based on the understanding that client choice is valuable, and exercising choice is likely to make a client more successful in remaining housed and improving their life. So that said, you as a provider may be required as a condition of funding to offer services. So again, there's no requirements on the tenant's end, but there are requirements on the provider's side. So in rapid rehousing, there may be a requirement for monthly case management check-ins, but that's a requirement of the program to make it available and offer the service. It's not a requirement that the client has to participate. Next slide, please. Okay, so relatedly, this is related, Housing First rests on the idea that everyone is housing ready and that everyone deserves housing. So homelessness programs and housing providers must be consumer ready, which includes meeting people where they are. However, this is housing first, not housing only. So supportive services are part of the Housing First model. So here's an example. A client gets referred to a permanent supportive housing program, and upon meeting for screening, the program staff observed that the client may have a mental illness or a substance use disorder. Instead of questioning if they're appropriate, the program following a Housing First but not housing only model should accept that client into their program and connect them to mental health case management support, get in touch with the client's health plan to see what they may qualify for, talk to the participant to see if they're open to psychiatric care, offer treatment options that work best for the client, and keep the client in the program even if they decline these resources when first offered, and continue to build a trusting relationship to figure out how to support them to remain stably housed. And so, like my example with Anna, if they're not open to these conversations, you don't have them. So it's not like this is a laundry list and you go check, 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 check. But through a relationship, you start to explore these pieces. And the exact configuration of housing and services depends on the needs and the preferences of each person. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, let's talk more in depth about lower barrier admission policies. And I want to make clear that this applies to both rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. So Housing First flips the model from screening out, which some kind of traditional housing programs do. So instead of screening out applicants, this is screening in applicants. That's the task of Housing First. People are not precluded from housing based on having no income or an assessment of employability. Rental histories for people experiencing long-term homelessness are often poor and may include previous evictions. Those are not reasons for exclusion. Similarly, as we discussed in the principles, criminal histories are not reason to exclude people. And CoC resources in particular are the lowest, among the lowest, maybe the lowest federal housing resource there are. and people experiencing homelessness often have been shut out of other systems due to their barriers to housing. So if the CoC and the CoC resources don't house someone experiencing chronic homelessness or someone with multiple barriers to housing, they will likely remain homeless. Some people agree that this all makes sense for permanent supportive housing, but when it comes to rapid rehousing, in many communities, we often see more programmatic barriers put on top. However, even in rapid rehousing, these housing first practices apply. So when someone enters rapid rehousing, they exit homelessness. And the job of rapid rehousing stabilization is to build a relationship and help people stabilize. So help people increase income once they're housed, if that's possible. If that's not possible, the job is to continue with subsidized and affordable housing search and search for other permanent arrangements like moving in with family or friends. So the goal of the rapid rehousing programs is not that every participant can afford the rent of a private market unit on their own by the end of the rental assistance. An outcome is still successful if they find other permanent housing and don't return to homelessness. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Housing First strives for rapid and streamlined housing placements. So people experiencing homelessness, chronic homelessness, long-term homelessness, often experience anxiety or health crises or other issues during long wait times for housing. So the more streamlined and faster we can make this process, the better the outcomes. And this is really hard to do in high cost places like Oahu. Really hard to do. High rents, tight vacancy rates, those are real challenges. It's very different in other housing markets, and I want to acknowledge that. And there are still things you can do as a community to improve the processes. You may have to work harder than low cost markets. In fact, you do, but there are things you can still do. So like we mentioned before, looking at all your processes at the timelines from end to end and determine if there are requirements that have been added that could be taken out or done later, either at a system level or at a program level. And then also it's about looking at resources. Are there more resources that need to be added, like landlord incentives or flexible funding for unit applications that would speed up the process? Are there parts of coordinated entry that can be streamlined? These are all questions that we should be continuing to ask. And as your system changes, you keep asking the questions because things continue to change. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so services are voluntary. I have said that before. I'm going to say it again. They are proactively offered, and they are based in building trust and genuine relationships. So the services and the approach is human-centered. None of us want to be told what to do. None of us want to be told, don't do drugs, don't drink, clean your house. People experiencing homelessness may not have had an adequate support system while they were in crisis. So now once they are in housing and able to breathe, this is an opportunity to connect with others. So providers can adopt approaches and practices that creatively engage tenants to maximize and ensure housing stability. Through training and harm reduction approaches, service staff can learn to confront and mitigate the harms of drug and alcohol use through non-judgmental communication. Staff can receive training to develop competency around techniques like motivational interviewing, wellness, self-management, and trauma-informed care. These are all related practices to Housing First. And adoption of these practices often also requires continual reinforcement through effective clinical supervision, which is key to supporting housing stability. I know that the CoC is actively working on getting trainings for members on some of these topics. So we're launching a poll to find out what types of trainings are you most interested in related to these topics. So motivational interviewing, harm reduction, other related topics. Please weigh in. I like someone just giving the question a thumbs up. I take that as all of the above. I'm going to give people a little bit more time because this is a write-in. Okay, so I actually cannot see the actual responses. I don't know if anyone from Partners in Care can, but I know they're being recorded. So, and there are many opportunities to give this feedback. So if you haven't been able to give the feedback through the poll, send an email afterwards to Partners in Care about what types of training you would like. Even if you did respond to the poll, if you feel strongly, please, this is an invitation to give feedback. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we have a video that shows Housing First in practice. And then we're going to take a poll related to that. So I'll hand it over to you all.
Kind of soul of the work we do, because I think that's ultimately where you want the change to happen, in their environment. And so it's important to kind of support them and assist them in their environment.
Now, it's not a visit that's a treatment visit, and I think this is an important distinction. It's a visit much in the way that you would visit a relative.
Hey guys. Good. How you doing? Good. Good to see you.
Like a how you doing visit, and sort of checking to make sure that they're okay in the apartment.
We do home visits for a couple reasons.
It's the bedroom.
Ultimately, we are the housing provider. Things break in the apartment, not because of what the consumer did, but when you're renting an apartment, things break. Bedroom looks great.
Thank you.
It's important to get on that, to keep landlords accountable to their responsibility, but also keeping us accountable to what we need to do.
It's a visit like other home visits of care and concern.
Hey James, you want to talk at the couch? You get a more candid picture of how they're doing in their apartment, how they're doing psychiatrically, whether there's any issues coming up. I actually saw you yesterday. It was right up here. You was in Germantown, Cheltenham, and you were. And I almost beeped and jumped out, but I was like, oh, I should get going. But okay, yeah. I was like, oh, I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
So you get around a lot on your bike?
Yeah, a little amount, yeah, around the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You ever bike into the city or anything like that, or is that too far?
No, well, it's not too far, but I bike because I wait for a little more comeback. Now I'm feeling a little more comeback.
What's that mean?
Well, that just meant the body's feeling very normal, so that's what saved me. I could not exercise before, so I used the bike to exercise, and you build some little amount of muscle coming back up in the legs real slow.
I did want to focus in on his health, because that has been kind of a window into engaging him.
It's a program, right? It's not a housing authority where a person gets an apartment and they go. It's a program.
It's not like, hey buddy, how you doing? Good? You good? How's it going? Good? Take your meds, yeah? Everything all right? Good? See you tomorrow. Good? Right? And you come back to your team, how's buddy doing? Good. That's not what we're doing here, guys. It's a targeted intervention.
How have things been going with Dr. Laura?
Well, things have been going great with Dr. Laura, yeah.
Does taking the medications they have you on affect your body?
This affects my body as sweat out.
So is that uncomfortable for you?
Yeah, it's uncomfortable. But
have you told her about that?
No, I didn't tell her about that yet, because
some of the assessments that are going on kind of blend into just hanging out.
This might be the final blood test.
You get certain cues, like if the person is typically talkative and they're kind of reserved, and that might be a cue if something is going on. If they're usually well groomed and they have a less clean look, then maybe things are kind of deteriorating psychiatrically. You get clues into what's really going on in their apartment. And in the practical side, we can support them the best way we can. A lot of medications have different side effects. If they can adjust it or change in any way, and still get the positive effects of it,
right?
And you might not feel as uncomfortable as you are now.
Right.
That would be good.
That would be good, yeah.
So let Dr. Laura know kind of how you're feeling on the medication.
Right.
That'd be good.
Yeah.
The artfulness of the visit is that you're trying to engage people in services that they haven't actually asked for. They've only asked for housing often, And sometimes they won't ask for much more than that, but to sort of keep opening the door.
The birthday celebration is today.
Right.
So you're welcome to come down. We'll give you a ride.
Okay.
If you want to.
Okay.
We probably would leave Germantown 11:30. What are you thinking?
Yeah, that's cool.
That's cool? You gonna do it?
That'd be cool.
One thing I wanted to remind you about, because John in the housing department we've been getting electric bills for folks.
Right, yeah.
And you know, people have a certain amount of utility allowance.
Yeah, they told me
but
that.
once you go over, it'd be on you to.
Yeah.
And so I see that. So I don't want you to go over.
Right.
So you have to, so you don't have to pay.
Exactly. Yeah. I might be a little over or not. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe making the transition to living full-time independently is a tough transition. There's a new kind of learning curve they're going through.
This is a cheap air conditioner, and the little amount of air that.
Okay, this is a great video, so I know probably you want to just keep watching that as I do. But we're gonna keep moving through. There's a poll being launched now about to what degree your current agency's practices are aligned with the ones you see in the video. So it looks like so far about half of, well, I'll give people a few more minutes or a minute to respond. Yeah, so it looks like a little more than half of respondents are your agencies are fully aligned with these practices, which is great to hear. And then most other places are somewhat aligned. So there's, some differences across your community, and very few who are not aligned. Okay. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right. So this is about tenancy. So the ultimate goal of the Housing First approach is to help people experiencing homelessness achieve long-term housing stability in permanent housing. So permanent housing is defined as housing where tenants have leases that confer the full rights, responsibilities, and legal protections under federal, state, and local housing laws. So as part of Housing First services, tenants are educated about their lease terms. They're given access to legal assistance, and they're encouraged to exercise their full legal rights and responsibilities. Landlords and providers in Housing First models abide by their legally defined roles and obligations. So for instance, landlords and providers do not enter tenants' apartments without tenants' knowledge and permission, except under legally defined emergency circumstances. There are a few. Many Housing First permanent supportive housing programs also have tenant associations or a tenant council to review program policies and provide feedback, and formal processes for tenants to submit suggestions or grievances. Okay, next slide, please. I'm getting distracted by the questions. Okay. So preventing lease violations and evictions. So Housing First supportive housing programs should incorporate policies and practices that prevent lease violations and evictions among tenants. So for instance, program policies consistent with the Housing First approach do not consider alcohol or drug use in and of itself to be a lease violation, unless such use results in disturbances to neighbors or is associated with illegal activity like selling illegal substances. So Housing First models may have policies that give tenants some flexibility and recourse in rent payments. So rather than moving towards eviction proceedings due to missed rent payments or other reasons, programs can allow tenants to enter into payment installment plans for rental arrearages or offer money management assistance to tenants. So in a fully Housing First system, people are given multiple chances to preserve their tenancies. And then even if someone is ultimately evicted, ideally that provider or some provider in the system rehouses them in a new housing situation and continues to support them to abide by the next lease. It can be exhausting, And it also is how you keep vulnerable people housed. So, there are times where it's the 5th, 6th, 7th tenancy that sticks. And it's a lot of work to keep someone who's having a tough time in housing stable that many times, but it is part of the Housing First practice. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to move to questions, but I do have a few closing thoughts first. So I'm going to say it again, what I said at the beginning. Housing First is simple, but it's not easy. And even though it's so hard, all of you, and your system in Oahu is keeping people housed at a really high rate. When we looked at the data, 92% of people in Oahu continuum of care, permanent supportive housing, retained their housing or exited to other permanent housing destinations last year. So because Housing First is hard, and because permanent supportive housing, absolutely huge, huge accomplishment, a collective accomplishment, right? And because permanent supportive housing serves highly vulnerable people, there will be failures. It's never going to be at 100%. If it's at 100%, in fact, we might say, are you really serving the most vulnerable people? But in the field, anything above 90% is considered really excellent. I'll also say recruiting landlords is not easy, especially in a housing market like yours, especially when applicants have limited income or credit, or no income and very poor credit, or have a history of evictions. Helping people relearn the intricacies of tenancy is not easy. Navigating bureaucracy to secure mental health and physical health care is not easy. But Housing First as a concept is simple. Really, nothing in anyone's history, present, precludes them from being able to be housed, if you were to boil it down. So while the challenges to getting into that housing and maintaining that housing may be many, the goal is the same. Housing is the solution to homelessness. So I think we can move to questions and open it up. I think we're going to look at questions in the chat. So, and here's some poll. Here's some poll responses. So for response to poll 3, harm reduction was the top interest for training topics, then motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, substance use intervention, and then kind of lots of different ideas after that. So that's great. There's lots of practices that are related, and it's always helpful to get more tools to be able to support people. So we're going to take questions from the chat. I know some people have already put some in throughout the training, but if you have a question, please go ahead and put them into the chat, and then we'll start to answer them.
Yeah. I will go ahead. There was some from earlier, so we'll go ahead and start at the beginning there. The first question in the chat was, why can't we bring back drug testing?
So drug testing is not consistent with Housing First. And really, I mean, the answer I'll give from Housing First standpoint is that someone doesn't need to be sober to succeed in housing. I'm not saying that people who are in the throes of active addiction don't struggle in housing. Sometimes they do, but they also, some people using are fine tenants, and some people using need a lot of support. But it is certainly not, if we were to screen everyone out based on a drug test, you would have a lot of people remain homeless in your community. And you're the system that is there to support vulnerable people, including people who are actively using. And back to the statement I made at the beginning, you know, using drugs, alcohol is not the same as not being able to be stably housed. And if others, partners in care, if anyone has anything to add, please at any point jump in.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that answer.
Please.
What we want to do with our clients is we want to treat them like the general population. They have the same rights as anyone else, right? So I have a lease, like I'm a renter. If I want to get drunk tonight, no problem. My landlord is not going to kick me out. But if I get drunk and cause trouble with my neighbors, now my housing is at risk, right? If I want to get high tonight, You know, if I want to get high off of my behind, but I'm quiet and I'm not bothering anybody, then my housing is not at risk. It's my behavior that's going to put my housing at risk. So we want our clients to have the same rights as anybody and not treat them any differently. Just because they're, you know, a drug user, we're not going to say, well, you can't use drugs to be housed, because the general population can use drugs and maintain housing. So we don't want to separate them from the general population. We want them to be treated the same way as everybody else.
Beautifully said. I think that's right. And it comes back to the point that the contract is the lease. The contract is the tenancy. And so that's what we're focused on. That's, you know, that's what people in Housing First have agreed to, their tenants. And so if they're abiding by the lease, their use is almost irrelevant. And if they want support in, you know, recovery or harm reduction, that's where you can come in. But if they're abiding by the lease, then they're not compromising the agreement they've made.
Okay, great. If nobody else has anything to add to that question, we'll move to the next one. This question was from, I believe, Mahealani. So add to this if I missed the part, but before being referred to a program, shouldn't the clients have these resources in hand? I don't know if you want to elaborate on these resources, but yeah.
Does the person who asked the question want to elaborate on their question, or I can answer the best I can with information?
I believe
Hi.
it was
Sorry, my hand
yeah.
here.
Okay.
Hi, yeah,
Please.
so meaning like resources. So there's clients who are referred within the CES to a program that, yes, they may have outreach workers, but they may not have case management. So they're just stuck with housing specialists. Shouldn't they have like, especially after, say, we do an intake, we definitely observe they do need higher level of care. They don't have a health care plan. They don't have a case manager in plan. So that's what I meant by resources. Shouldn't they have this in plan before being referred to a program to make sure that they can be more successful, to have wraparound services?
I think that is not always possible. So you know, because that's not always possible, waiting for that to be in place means that person waits homeless. So in a Housing First system, it really is like you place people in housing and you get the services they need and want as quickly as possible. But I know I've heard from staff that there are gaps in your system. It sometimes takes time to get health care aides in place. That's true in a lot of places. In a lot of places, you know, someone gets housed and that's where you start. And the housing program is there to support them and make the connections, but those connections can take time. And that transition can be a time of vulnerability. And so, you know, there are some models where, you know, the staffing model accounts for maybe having more time for clients who are newly housed. And then over time, sometimes people need less support. That's not always true. It's not linear. It's not the same for everyone, but that can be the case. But I think the problem with waiting is, for some people, waiting is not an option. Waiting is life-threatening. You know, waiting may be forever if you're waiting for all the resources to be there. That said, I think your question may have a piece to it about, you know, these are the gaps we're seeing. This is what someone really needs right when they're getting to housing. How can we build that as a community? How can we build a bridge? You know, if there is a gap, you know, of 2 months or 5 months or whatever, where someone needs something more intensive and the other systems you're working with can't come in faster, how do you build in those resources to support people as best you can?
Okay, great. The next question here, when following the Housing First model, is an unassignment ever appropriate? And if so, when?
I don't know that term, unassignment. Is that a term you all use?
That would be like a denial from a housing program. So if CES refers someone to a housing program, there are sometimes reasons why they might be unassigned or just not be able to move forward with enrolling in the program and working towards placement. So I think that was the question.
Okay. I mean, I think I would have to hear kind of what those examples might be. You know, if someone, so the question is like, when would you move on from a match? You know, someone might be matched and then they're unavailable. Can someone help me out on like a scenario?
Yeah. I have you on a scenario.
Great.
So in a rapid housing program, a household was successfully housed, but continuously would avoid contact with case managers, despite case managers going in and attempting to make contact and offering services, right? So the case manager's following through on the contractual obligation, but the client's not receptive to even meeting with the case manager. Where is the line there between like not even having any contact with the client? Is that a reason for unassignment or removal from the program?
This happens all the time. I guess my question would be, are they abiding by their lease? If the answer is yes, then no. But I mean, from a Housing First lens, that person is abiding by what they have contractually agreed to.
Thank you.
Okay. The next question on here is to rehouse a client after an eviction, we are burning landlords. Why would rehousing consumer who shows they are not ready for independent housing? I think there's maybe a typo. Why would?
Yeah.
You asked that question. Sorry.
I think,
the question
yeah,
again?
no, I think I understand. Why would we rehouse someone who has failed out of housing or burned a bridge with a landlord? Why would we try again? The answer is because that is how that person's homelessness will ever be ended. And so I you know, it's not easy. But it is the philosophy of ending homelessness, is that everyone needs to be housed. And so and like I said, sometimes it takes several rounds. Sometimes someone, you know, their life shifts and then they can be in a tenancy. Sometimes it's that specific housing situation that didn't work. They were reactivated because of the neighborhood they were in, but in another neighborhood, they're able to manage their trauma more. You know, there are a lot of reasons why a certain situation or a certain moment in someone's life, you know, doesn't work to be stable, especially, you know, people who've experienced complex trauma, multiple traumas, maybe, you know, have never experienced stability. And so we believe in people, we stick with people. And I'm not saying it's easy, but that is the Housing First philosophy.
Hi. So next question is, what are your thoughts about operationalizing Housing First for youth/young adults?
I think Housing First works great for youth and young adults. And I think some of you think Housing First works great for young adults. So operationalizing, maybe that's not the question. I think it's the same. I don't think, and kind of to the point that I forget his name, the person who came off mute made earlier, young people are people, and Housing First is really about a person-centered approach and not treating people who've experienced homelessness really any different from other tenants. So if a young person can abide by a lease, then they can enter into a lease, and I believe anyone can abide by a lease. It is, you know, and we don't know ahead of time who will and will not behave in different ways. And so I've seen Housing First work really, really well for young people. And often young people, you know, what young people often need is housing and opportunity. And once they get those two things, they just sail. And sometimes they leave, you know, all sorts of support. And they can kind of move away from housing assistance and case managers, and they just move on with their lives. So I think it works well. I don't know if there's a follow-up question. If there is, you know, more to that question that you want to put in the chat, I'd be happy to talk more. Or if other people, maybe people who work in the youth space, who want to comment, please do.
Okay, and the next question here, if no one has anything to add, how do we balance the need for coordinated entry to gather enough information about folks to place them in appropriate housing with the need to house folks quickly?
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of appropriate housing can really bog down a system. Like, we want to know everything about a person and exactly what it's going to take to make a perfect match with the perfect services. And you know, people don't work that way. People don't always disclose everything that's going on with them. So I would say, really, it is hard to know everything someone might need before they're housed. They may not know. They're in crisis. So, so a lot of that assessment and a lot of that resource matching can happen once someone's housed. It's really hard to do, to like figure it all out ahead of time and have it all in hand. You know, we don't live in that world because our systems are underfunded and our systems don't work that well. So really, Housing First is about get someone to housing. That's when you can really start an assessment, an engagement, a relationship. That's when that person can start to think clearly, you know, maybe after a month or 2 months of being able to sleep. You know, there might be more clarity about what someone needs. I don't think you can gather a lot of that at the coordinated entry process.
Okay, next question is, why can't Housing First add that principle of drug testing? Sorry, referring back to the first question. If clients voluntarily approved the drug testing.
Yeah, so that's, you know, there could be drug testing could be part of an engagement. If a client's saying, I would like to be drug tested, that'll help me in my recovery, and that's something your agency is comfortable doing, sure. It's not that you can't drug test someone voluntarily. It's that you can't, Housing First doesn't allow drug testing to be a litmus test about whether or not someone can get housed. So, and I think the element of choice is the important part in that. If a client is raising their hand asking you to drug test them, that's a very different story than saying you need to take this drug test, and if you fail, you can't get housed. Those are very different things.
Okay.
We're almost at the top of the hour, so I'm concerned we aren't going to get to all the questions, but these are such great questions, and I wish that I was, you know, in the room with you all and we could actually have a dialogue to talk more about what's behind your questions, because I think I'm just scratching the surface. But like we said at the beginning, this is the beginning of a conversation for your community. You're clearly incredibly dedicated. You all are already housing vulnerable people and keeping them housed. You're changing your policies. So I'm just honored to have been with you for this hour. And if I can support, I would be happy to behind the scenes. And I hope you continue on this process. So thank you again for having me. And these questions will all be recorded, and we can continue to dialogue offline. So thanks, everyone.
This is Lorican. Thank you, Laila. This is that was excellent. Hopefully people got a lot of information from this. But as you said, this is just the beginning of this training. So there's some really great questions in the chat. You know, how many times can a person be rehoused, and challenges with HUD and their pressure on rent reasonableness and things like that. So we will get to all of these questions, and we'll put a little format together on them, and we will work towards getting the next training up and running, and that one will be based on what you guys feel you either didn't get from this training or want to add to this training, or even if we just want to invite Laila back again to continue this conversation. So thank you so much, everyone. This was a great attended training, and we'll keep on hanging in there with you and whatever training you need, and working on the resources. I know that's the biggest thing, is the wraparound services and making sure that those are available. We just need to keep on plugging away at that. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you all soon. Take care.
The recording will be available on the PIC website by tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laila.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.